This is week 4, module 2, and we're going to talk about use of trust and gifting. And we went back to really week 1 when we started talking about trust. And now, from the rest of the course, is primarily going to be a trust course, as a matter of fact. So let's get right into it. Um, let's see. Start off with net gifts. A net gift is when the donor requires the donee to pay the gift tax as a condition of making the gifts. It's usually when the donor has a liquidity problem. I've had several times where clients wanted to get their assets out of the estate, but there was no liquidity. In one case, the family owned like 5 apartment houses, but there was no way that she could get the gift to her son without having problems because of the gift tax. So what happened is this son picked up the gift tax. And that worked very well for her. And I've had several other cases the same way where they wanted to get gifts to get out of the estate, but because of liquidity problems, um, they couldn't do it. And that also reminds me to remind you that insurance is almost a requirement today for anybody who has any type of assets, because you're going to need the insurance to take care of the debts and the taxes, etc. And we'll cover that later in the course, but I think this is a good point to bring it up because that's where this net gift comes in, the lack of liquidity. You can have all the assets in the world you want, but you got to have liquidity. Section 2503B trust. This is another name for family trust, and it has multiple names. It is actually from the IRS code section 2503B. So those of you who like to look at the IRS code at night so that you can put yourself to sleep, just go to 2503B and you'll see a well-written description. We don't go into as much depth as the IRS does, and obviously, again, we're not going to be experts on it, but we will cover it to the point of being able to understand it. The big advantage of this trust is you can have multiple beneficiaries, and we can have beneficiaries where we have a present interest and a future interest. And I like to see this, for example, well, you might see it as a trust setup for the individual as a part of their estate plan where they say, I'm setting up a trust that's going to be uh, revocable, and at death, the assets go to my children and they get the income off of those assets during their lifetime, and at their death, it goes to my grandchildren. Now, one of the things you have to be careful in this nice trust is to make sure the trustee isn't in a general power of appointment. So if you have one of your children being the trustee, uh, they are going to have a conflict of interest in effect, so it gives them a general power of appointment. And if that's true, they need an ascertainable standard or 5x5 power. So it's also called the mandatory trust, family trust, and income trust. Again, lots of names. It's a very popular trust. You can actually get a present interest in it, and if you do it right, again, that's not something I recommend you even try to do because it gets too complex for the average individual you're going to have as a client. But there's a lot of things that you can do with this trust, and certainly is a very popular trust. Another popular trust also done by the Internal Revenue Service is the 2503C trust. And before we had the 529 plans for college education, this was by far, in my opinion, the best way of saving for college. And probably in many ways is still a good way because you don't necessarily have to go to college. And with the 529 plan, it has to be used for college. But the 2503C plan could allow the money just to be saved so the child has some money to start a business or get married or whatever. Very, very good use. It's for donees under 21 because it's under federal law. At the age is 21, where under state law, it's usually age of majority. There is only one donee per trust. That makes it unique. Again, that's why it might be used as well as a college savings trust. It's eligible for the annual exclusion as the IRS says they are present interest. And when the IRS says it's present interest, it's a present interest. And we haven't gotten into annual exclusions yet, but when we will, we'll find that that's a big advantage for people who want to give gifting to their children or their grandchildren for education. I know in our family we set them up when my children were young, at a very young age, trust for each of the children so that the grandparents, the uncles, and the aunts and everybody could put money in without having to worry about gift tax. There's a blind trust. It's an irrevocable trust used to transfer assets for asset management by a third party. And that is, again, for politicians, is I think the main place should see that, so that they aren't accused of acting in interest that helps themselves, supposedly. A revocable trust, it's the most common type of trust by far in this country. It's used to hold assets during lifetime, and it's very effective as a will substitute. And I would say that the family trust is a good example of that. The individual trust, like the Li Shu Trust of 2003. Pour-over trust, a revocable living trust designed to receive and dispose of assets at death. Back in the second week, we had the Elvis Presley Trust that was in the information section, reference section. That was a good example of a pour-over trust, in which the trust is created by the will to take the assets at death and administer the assets after probate. In other words, too often after probate, the beneficiaries get the assets and they waste them. By use of a pour-over trust, you can protect the assets from being wasted or reduce it. Spendthrift trust, trust with the provision limiting the beneficiary's ability to assign an interest to the trust and prevents creditors from attaching the trust to interest. I think lawyers put this in every trust because it is a good preventer from creditors getting at the assets while it's in trust. Now remember, as soon as the assets leave the trust, then the creditors can get at it, but while they're in the trust, they're safe from the creditors. A springing trust event activates the trust. It could be going in the hospital. It could be two doctors saying that you have to no longer be able to handle your finances. It might be leaving the country on an airplane. It might be leaving the state. Whatever criteria is called out in the trust, has the trust take effect when that item is met, and it's a very good substitute for power of attorney. In fact, I think it's a much better substitute for attorney. We'll be looking at those later on in the course. A discretionary trust has the authority to decide to distribute or not distribute income or corpus. Some criteria is needed for the trustee. Several comments on this one. First of all, it goes by various names. It does allow the trustee to make decisions, and that, of course, is where the general power of appointment issue comes up, because they could, under a general power of appointment, be able to make the benefits go to themselves. So it's something that's quite common in life, and certainly should trigger you the question of whether or not there's a GPA involved if it comes up with a client or a test. It says some criteria is needed for the trustee. Well, I've seen trusts that didn't have any criteria. It should be required is probably what it is, so that the trustee knows what to do. And for those of you who have trust set up in that and you're not sure if it's complete, that the lawyer did a good job, or unfortunately sometimes people don't use lawyers, the easiest way is to go to your local bank trust department and ask them if they would review the trust for you. And the way you have to do that is saying, would you be willing to take over management of this trust? If they say yes, you know it's a good trust. There's no problems with it. If they say no, then you know you got a problem there. And maybe they'll even tell you what the problem is. For example, criteria might not be clear enough as to when this payment should be made or how to be made. Okay, that is the end of this session, and we'd like to have you next go to Module 3 at your convenience.